Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Sophocles' play Ajax. So Ajax is having a bit of a renaissance in the past 15 or 20 years. Not necessarily for a great reason, although as a fan of Greek drama, I'm always glad to see Greek drama getting attention. But I'll talk more about why this play is having a particular renaissance. So, the story of Ajax is basically that during the Trojan War, when Achilles died, who was the greatest Greek hero to go to Troy, Ajax, who was the second greatest Greek hero, thought that he should be gifted Achilles' armor, which was a mark of incredible honor. When the sons of Atreus, Agamemnon and Menelaus, decided instead to give it to Odysseus, Ajax basically goes berserk. So he decides that he's going to go basically kill the entire Greek leadership and as many other Greeks as he can. Athena tricks him basically into thinking that a bunch of livestock are the Greeks that he's attacking, so he goes and he slaughters a bunch of these sheep and goats and cattle and whatever it is. When he sort of comes back to his senses, he's disgraced by this, and so he commits suicide, which was very, very common among Greeks and Romans. They didn't have the Judeo-Christian prohibition on suicide that's now so central to Western thinking about suicide. So he throws himself on his sword, which is a way of recovering his honor after this great shame. Then there's a conflict over his body. Menelaus and Agamemnon don't want him buried because he tried to kill them and because he disrupted the army. Ajax's brother, I'm blanking on his name, Tuker, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he basically, like Antigone in Sophocles' version of the Antigone story, Tuker says that he's going to bury Ajax's body anyway, and basically there's a sort of drawn-out struggle over this until Odysseus shows up. And Odysseus, who was Ajax's greatest enemy in the army, is basically like, yeah, actually the right thing to do is to bury him because he was a great hero and he deserves that honor. He doesn't deserve he first off doesn't deserve to be dishonored like this, and it reflects badly on us, the rest of us Greeks who are still alive, if we dishonor this great hero in this way. And so that's sort of the resolution of the play, is Ajax ultimately is buried. But there are a couple of major different ways of reading this play. There's a very classical, traditional way which focuses on Ajax as a figure of hubris. So in Aristotle's Poetics, in his reading of tragedy, one of the key things that Aristotle is interested in is the idea of hubris leading to the downfall of a tragic hero. And hubris is basically overconfidence, or excessive pride. And so we get this idea of Ajax as a figure of hubris fairly early on in the play, because we start basically with Odysseus scouting around and trying to figure out what happened, whether or not Ajax was actually the one who slaughtered these sheep. And Athena comes to him and basically says, yeah, he did it because I put a mist over his senses so that he thought he was slaughtering the Greeks. And Odysseus at one point says, and yet I pity him, against me though he is, for he is shackled to a dreadful end. So that idea of fate is also really central to Greek tragedy. His fate makes me think of my own. And actually, that's a meaningful reference if you think about Homer's The Odyssey. His fate makes me think of my own. I see that our lives are nothing but illusion, fugitive shades. And Athena replies, seeing this is so, let no haughty word against the gods escape your lips, nor be puffed up if you excel another in prowess or material gain. A single day can level down or level up every human enterprise. Heaven loves the wise man, and with the arrogant will have no part. So the idea here is that Ajax is punished by the gods because of his arrogance, because of his overconfidence. And later on, we get a clearer picture of this, because at one point a soldier comes in as a messenger, and he tells them what Calchas, who is the Greek seer or prophet at the Trojan War, said. So according to this messenger, Calchas said, when men's lives are swollen with hubris, they are toppled down by some disaster sent from heaven. And Calchas explains what Ajax's transgressions were. The first was when, before leaving Salamis, which is where Ajax was from, his father gives him advice to honor the gods and trust in their support in battle. And Ajax says, Father, a mere nobody can triumph with the help of heaven, but I expect to achieve that glory even without. And then later, when Athena, who's the god who ultimately punishes Ajax, Athena is helping him in battle, and he addresses her and says, Queen, go and help the other Argives. I don't need propping up in battle. So, because Ajax sets himself up as a superior warrior who doesn't require the assistance of the gods, he is brought low for his hubris. He's brought low for this arrogant overconfidence. So this is a very traditional reading of the play, and there's certainly a lot here to support that idea. The part of the reason that this play has had such a renaissance in the past 15 or 20 years is because a more contemporary interpretation actually sees it as a story about PTSD, about a traumatized soldier who, because of the experiences he's had in battle, is psychologically disturbed. And the reason that that's become such a prolific reading recently is actually because there's a new generation of traumatized veterans from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so there have been theater practitioners who have actually worked with returning soldiers on Greek tragedy to try and find some ways of working through the psychological trauma of combat and of PTSD. So we get some descriptions of Ajax's behavior that are really quite fitting in terms of describing what we know about PTSD. So, for instance, Odysseus and Athena are discussing what happened, and and how she sort of tricked Ajax into killing all of these sheep. And she says, I infused his eyes with a criminal fancy and switched his frenzy onto the livestock and animals with their keepers and not yet distributed. She later says, I'll show you openly his insanity. And then she refers to him as a manifest madman. So we have these references continually throughout to Ajax as being insane. And we've got a bunch of references to him sort of not knowing what was going on, to him misperceiving things and things like this. But then one of the best, in my opinion, one of the best descriptions of Ajax as suffering PTSD comes from Tecmessa, who's Ajax's war bride, basically. He captured her in battle, essentially, and sort of married her, and they have a son together. But she describes what happened at the end of his attack on this livestock. She says, then he bundled back into the tent, where gradually and painfully he came to his senses. Casting his eyes at the shambles in the tent, he battered his head and uttered a horrible shout, and collapsed among the prostrate carcasses of butchered sheep. There he squatted, clenching his fists and tearing his hair. He sat for a long time without saying a word. Then he began to threaten me unless I recounted the whole grisly affair, demanding to know exactly where he stood. I was terrified, my friends, and told him all that happened as best I could. Immediately he broke down in loud sobs, such as I had never heard from him before, for he always used to say that no real man, only the craven and cowardly cried. But his crying was a deep bellow like a wounded bull. Floored by the disaster, without food or drink, he now sits where he collapsed in a welter of sword-slashed beasts. He's obviously contemplating some terrible act, which his words of remorse prefigure. So again, we've got these various symptoms that really suggest PTSD. His dissociation from the things he's done, his inability to remember, his uncharacteristic emotional reactions, crying, screaming, rocking back and forth, all of these things as a way of, like, this is a response to trauma. And again, this idea that she ends with in that section, that his terrible words prefigure some awful action. I mean, we know later he goes and he commits suicide, which unfortunately is a massively common problem among veterans, especially those with PTSD. And so again, a lot of people now, in the context of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, are rereading Ajax as a story about a traumatized soldier who can't work through that experience. And so the idea of the gods punishing him becomes somewhat secondary to the idea that the horrendous experiences he has in combat have damaged Ajax's mind.